Oh, my goodness. You never know what you're going to get at a Watchmen conference, and I'm just so glad that that the hotel has amazing staff and amazing resources. So I know she's going to be okay. But anyway, so we were supposed to have a half an hour break, but we ran over time because we had an amazing judge at our luncheon. We had an amazing Peggy Hall who spent a little extra time educating you and inspiring you. So I am going to ask that all of you, if you don't mind, if you stay seated, give the tech guys a little time to get Derek Gilbert's computer set up. And once we get that done, we will start. So it shouldn't take more than 10 minutes. If everyone is willing to just hang tight, let's do it, okay? Just keep your seat, say hi to the people around you, and just relax. Thank you. We just are so grateful that you were willing to stay seated and just take a little break since we ran a little off schedule. But now we have someone that's going to always knock your socks off at every conference we do, and this time in particular, he's really going to knock your socks off. This is Derek Gilbert, host of Skywatch TV's 5 and 10, co-host with his wife Sharon K. Gilbert of Unraveling Revelation and a new show, The Bible's Greatest Mysteries, which debuts in 2 weeks. Warm welcome for Derek Gilbert.
Thank you, Jeannie. Thank you. This should be an interesting presentation because it's changed about 4 times in the last hour. So I'm either going to end up pounding the pulpit here or crying. I'm not sure which, and maybe a little bit of both. But in a good way, because I tend to get emotional when I do presentations like this. I don't know why. I don't know, maybe God has wired me this way from a little child. My mother, who's 84 years old, tells all the people at the retirement home where she lives that, yeah, he started talking at 18 months and he hasn't stopped. And she's right, because God, for his reasons, has prepared me to do what we do now, and I am grateful. But an essential part of that preparation was pairing me with the one person in this world who gets me and loves me for who I am and has encouraged me to do things that I never thought I could do. Men, if you're married to a woman like this, you know what I'm talking about, where you go out in the morning and you feel like you can slay dragons. That's how Sharon makes me feel every day. Things have gotten really weird in America, have they not? They have gotten really, really bizarre over the last 18 months, which was just about the time we were at the last Hear the Watchmen conference, which is the last full-blown conference we were able to attend before they shut down travel. So it's fitting that we're back here with Hear the Watchmen and Mike and Jeannie. And we are thankful that you're here, thankful for all of you who are watching on the video stream or taking advantage of video on demand. If you're watching in the future, welcome. We hope the future turned out great. But if it doesn't, and again, by our human standards, things may not go the way we want them to go. You think the apostles would have signed up for the job if they knew they were going to be beheaded, martyred, crucified upside down, crucified on an X-shaped cross, boiled in oil? Maybe not. But maybe they would have after they saw the risen Christ. Well, guess what? We've got the benefit of 2,000 years of hindsight. So we don't have an excuse for not standing on the promises that Jesus Christ left us with. So when we look around at the world today, we should not be surprised at what we see happening. We should not be distracted from the one job that we were given. And we should not be discouraged, most of all. There are a few things that have happened here over the last year that I don't think any of us would have predicted, certainly not what we would have hoped for, but things that have had a profound impact on where we are right now. Number one, The inauguration of Joe Biden, meh. This will not be a political discussion, so we will just set that to the side. Mr. Biden is not the problem, he is a symptom. The second thing I want to talk about, the great conjunction of December 21st, 2020, on the winter solstice of 2020. If I were a conspiracy theorist, I'd say, well, this was rather a coincidence theorist. I'd say this is just a coincidence, but I'm not a coincidence theorist. History shows that conspiracies do exist. Just read Psalm 2. Why the nations rage and imagine a vain thing? Yeah, the Lord laughs in derision. The great conjunction of December 1st, 2020, to us Christians, this was just an interesting astronomical event. But the media kept telling us, it's the Christmas star. Well, no, it was not the Christmas star. Now, the famed astronomer Johannes Kepler back in the 17th century thought this might have been what the Magi saw back at the time of the birth of Jesus. I mean, this was an interesting event. This was the first observable conjunction of the planets Jupiter and Saturn in 800 years. But this was not the Christmas star. I'm sorry, we went out in the Ozarks where we've got very little light pollution and saw this, not quite this close, but all right, interesting. 2 bright lights in the sky, not enough to make me, if I were 2,000 years old, want to cross the desert of Syria to find the king of the world. The Christmas star, the actual Christmas star, was something a little more miraculous than that. But the secular world, they're more than happy to have us believe that this was what the wise men saw. There's a natural explanation for all of that. Well, astrologers, however, saw something very profound in this, and that's the point. Now, you and I know that our lives are not governed by the movement of the planets through the sky. But very powerful and very wealthy people do believe that. And that's why this event on the winter solstice of 2020 is significant. See, astrologers call this the great mutation, not the great conjunction, but the great mutation. Because on that night, Jupiter and Saturn, representing the chief god of the Roman Pantheon and the former god of the Roman Pantheon, Saturn, who'd been overthrown by his son, the storm god Jupiter, and banished to Tartarus, met within 1 degree of each other at 0 degrees of the constellation Aquarius. Believe it or not, if you're old enough like me to remember the song from the Fifth Dimension, 50 years later, we have finally fully entered the age of Aquarius. They were singing about it in the 60s. We finally, on December 21st of 2020, we have entered the age of Aquarius. Why is that a big deal? Because according to astrologers, this represents the dawn of a new golden age. The dawn of a new golden age. Again, very important people believe that the stars rule our lives, and it's not a coincidence that the World Economic Forum, just 1 month after the Great Mutation, laid out the plans of the Great Reset. The other event we need to talk about, which was really significant, and credit to Sharon for spotting this. She has an eye for spotting things that I tend to miss. I tend to be like my father, very linear. He was an engineer. Got a problem, point A, point B, problem solved. Sharon tends to see problems and things outside the box. And she spotted the significance of this event, the January 6th event, 2020. Now, the media and politicians would have us believe that this was an insurrection. If this was an insurrection, it was the worst rebellion in the history of humanity. No clue, no plan, no end game, no objective, no weapons. And yet, this was an insurrection. And if you say otherwise, you're probably a dirty, conservative, MAGA hat-wearing anti-vaxxer. So those are the events that I want to talk about over the next hour. Now, why is this all relevant? How does this matter? We need to go back 2,000 years to the year 40 BC. 40 BC, a poet in Rome by the name of Virgil wrote this. It's called the Fourth Eclogue. Eclogue 4 by Virgil. He cites the Cumaean Sibyl in these lines. The money quote is right here. Now the last age by Cumae's Sibyl sung has come and gone, and the majestic roll of circling centuries begins anew. Justice returns old Saturn's reign with a new breed of men sent down from heaven. Okay. What all does that mean exactly, and why is that relevant to us 2,000 years later? The Golden Age that's referred to in this poem, and he gets to that a little bit later on in the poem, but for time's sake, we'll condense it. He references the beginning of a new golden age, heralded by the return of Saturn's reign. This is a reference to the four ages written about by the Greek poet Hesiod. Now, Hesiod wrote some very important works called Works and Days and the Theogony, and from those, we get a lot of what we know about Greek religion, what we were taught as mythology. You know, the Greeks took it very seriously. Hesiod wrote it about the same time as the prophet Isaiah. The Greeks were sacrificing even humans to their gods. So, yeah, when you see mythology, just remember, that's kind of casting it like Aesop's fables. These were not just life tales that ancient Greeks taught their kids to teach them how to behave. This was their religion. And Hesiod wrote that there were four ages of history. The Golden Age, when Kronos, king of the Titans, ruled in heaven, and life was easy because the earth gave of its bounty without any work. Sounds like Eden. And that's kind of the point. This is fake history that Hesiod was taught and the Greeks were taught by the fallen realm. That was followed by a Silver Age, when humanity was less noble because they were lazy. They were childlike, even late into adulthood, and so things weren't quite as good. Then there was a Bronze Age, ruled over by the storm god Zeus, the Greek version of Jupiter, where men were warlike and violent and things were bloody and it was awful. And now we live in the Iron Age, where we never rest and the gods make us work and things are really awful. But a Golden Age is returning. And that's what Virgil was writing about in the 1st century BC. The return of a golden age when Saturn will return. Now, what was the political situation in ancient Rome? 40 BC. They just had a civil war. Julius Caesar had just become the first emperor, essentially. It was still technically the Roman Republic, and that's why the senators assassinated Julius. That led to a second triumvirate led by Julius's nephew Octavian, later Caesar Augustus, Mark Antony of Antony and Cleopatra fame, and then a guy named Lepidus who history has forgotten. You can forget you ever heard about him. He's not relevant. He is, not appearing in this film. Virgil, writing at the year 40 BC, wrote this poem because as a poet who didn't produce pottery or wasn't making wood art, basically you weren't producing something tangible, so you had to appeal to somebody with money to be a sponsor. And so he wrote to a guy named Gaius Asinius Pollio, who became a consul of Rome. Consul is like the president, okay? It was the highest elected office in Rome back in the day. And he was saying, essentially, with this poem, that with your term as consul, O Gaius, the golden age will return, and thine own Apollo shall reign. Well, that's a reference, I believe, to Octavian, Caesar Augustus, who was so enamored with the god Apollo that he actually built a temple of Apollo, connected it to his own home. So this was a political thing, but because he cited the Cumaean Sibyl, who played a very important role in the founding story of Rome, Virgil was considered a prophet. In fact, not just by pagans, but by Christians. In the 4th century AD, Emperor Constantine, who legalized Christianity, you heard about him? Yeah, Constantine decided that this poem, written 300 years earlier by Virgil, was actually a prophecy of the birth of Jesus. And that's how it was taught by the church for many, many years. Well, no, because he was not coming back to earth with a new breed of men sent down from heaven. I mean, to my skeptical eyes, that reads like a prophecy of the return of the Nephilim. But, I'm a friend of L.A. Marzulli, so what do I know? Conspiracy theorist. But Virgil was considered a prophet to the point where they would take his works. Virgil, probably best known for writing the Aeneid, which is sort of an origin story of Rome, where Aeneas, who was a survivor of the Trojan War, he was one of the royal princes of Troy, made his way to Italy after the Trojan War, and eventually his descendants became the founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus. So people would take the Aeneid by Virgil and flop it open to a page, put their finger down on it, and whatever verse they stumbled onto, that was their prophecy for the day. Not to step on anybody's toes here, but some of us use the Bible that way. Am I right? I mean, again, not to offend anyone, but that's not how we read the Bible. But that's certainly, as Christians, not how you use pagan works. But even as late as the modern era, in the 17th century, King Charles I of England, the guy who lost his head to Oliver Cromwell in the big rebellion they had there, he took the Aeneid, flopped it open. This was after he'd been captured by Cromwell, and his prophecy didn't turn out too well. He was dead within a few months. But this is how Virgil's works have been used. It is known from history that at least 4 Roman emperors and one who tried to usurp the throne of Rome used Virgil's works because he cited the Cumaean Sibyl. The Cumaean Sibyl was a woman from Cumae, which is a Greek colony on the southern tip of Italy, who, it's the way the story goes, she came to the first king of Rome, whose name was Tarquinius Superbus. Tarquin the Proud. He was an Etruscan, which is interesting because the Etruscans actually came from the region of Troy before they settled in Italy. They too were survivors of the Trojan War. Anyway, she had 9 scrolls with her. And she says to Tarquin, I will sell you these scrolls for this exorbitant price. Tarquin laughed. Said, go away. So she took 3 of them, threw them on the fire, and said, okay, I'll sell you these 6 scrolls of oracles for the same price as the original 9. Tarquin said, why would I do that? Get out of here. So she took 3 more and threw them on the fire and said, okay, I'll let you have these last 3 scrolls of oracles for the price of the original 9. And at this point, Tarquin's augurs, his soothsayers, came to him and said, King, she might have something here, because otherwise she's just absolutely nuts. And she is from Cumae, where the Sibylline oracle. So Tarquin pays up. They get the 3 scrolls. These were so important. This took place around the year 539, 540 BC. These were so important that in Rome, this Roman Senate had a small group of men who were the only ones authorized to look at the scrolls. Started out as 3. I think that ultimately it was no more than 15 men were the only ones who could go into the temple of Jupiter where they were kept and look at these scrolls. Whenever there was a bad omen, a shooting star, we have to consult the scrolls. These men would go and look at the oracles. And in fact, in a civil war around 80 BC, the temple of Jupiter burned. The scrolls got burned. The Roman Senate panicked, and they sent agents out throughout the Roman Empire to the oracles. We need new oracles! And they collected new prophecies and oracles and brought them back to Rome and put them in the temple of Jupiter, which had been rebuilt. That's how important these were to ancient Rome. And this is why Virgil and his 4th eclogue were considered prophecy. In fact, this was so important to Rome that in the 16th century, when Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel, the roof of the Sistine Chapel, he put the Sibylline oracles up there alongside the Hebrew prophets like Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel. The Cumaean Sibyl is on the wall, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And it's really weird because she was an old lady, and so the way Michelangelo painted her, she looks like, she's got an old face, but she's got guns. She looks like an Olympic hammer thrower. It's really weird. It's really creepy. I say all of that, give you all that history, just to point out how important this was to ancient Rome and Rome's self-identity, because it's important to where we are in America today. In fact, Virgil and his prophecy, put that in air quotes, why we have this on the backside of every dollar bill in circulation in the United States today. Secretary of the Continental Congress, Charles Thomson, when he designed the seal, the Great Seal of the United States in 1792, placed the phrase Novus Ordo Seclorum on the back of the dollar bill. That means New Order of the Ages. This is from line 5 of Virgil's 4th eclogue, Magnus ab integro seclorum nascitur ordo. The majestic roll of circling centuries begins anew. The beginning of a new golden age. It's on the back of every dollar bill in circulation. And he adapted the other Latin phrase on the back of the dollar bill from Virgil's The Georgics. Annuit coeptis means providence favors our undertakings. Providence favors our undertakings. The question you got to ask whenever somebody says they believe in God, which one? Exactly. Which God are you talking about? Yep. Because I don't think, you keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means. Well, Henry Wallace, who was Franklin Roosevelt's vice president from 1941 to 1945, like Roosevelt, was a 32nd degree Freemason. He suggested that the reverse of the Great Seal, which is the pyramid with the unfinished eye, thank you, the unfinished pyramid with the all-seeing eye, be added to the back of the dollar bill. So Roosevelt specifically requested that it be placed on the left. Wallace's suggestion was that it would be placed at the front of the Great Seal on the left and the reverse on the right. Franklin Roosevelt switched it because we assume, as English speakers and readers, reading left to right, that the more important of the two is placed on the left, even though the reverse of the Great Seal has never been used to seal an official United States government document, only the front. So why is it on the back of our dollar bill? Why is it on the back of the dollar bill? As Tom Horn wrote in Zenith 2016, Wallace viewed the unfinished pyramid with the all-seeing eye hovering above it on the Great Seal as a prophecy about the dawn of a new world with America at its head. Whenever the United States assumed its position as the new capital of the world, Wallace wrote, the grand architect, which God you talking about, would return, and metaphorically the all-seeing eye would be fitted atop the Great Seal pyramid as the finished apex stone. And for that to happen, Wallace wrote, in 1934, it will take a more definite recognition of the grand architect of the universe, which God you talking about, before the apex stone is finally fitted into place and this nation, in the full strength of its power, is in position to assume leadership among the nations in inaugurating the new order of the ages, Novus Ordo Seclorum. So, how does this connect to the return of Saturn? Returns old Saturn's reign. Well, first of all, who is Saturn? I argue in my forthcoming book, The Second Coming of Saturn, that he is all of these, that he has gone by many names, many identities throughout history, roughly in order of appearance. Shemiyaza, the Watcher Chief who led the rebellion on Mount Hermon. In prehistoric times, prior to the flood, Shemiyaza and 200 landed on Mount Hermon. Why do I say that? Because 2 Peter 2:4 says that God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into, the word in English is hell, but in Greek it's Tartarosis. He threw them down into Tartarus, not Hades. There's a difference between those two. Hades is equivalent to Sheol, the netherworld, where the run-of-the-mill dead would go. Tartarus is the abyss, the bottomless pit. It's reserved for supernatural threats to divine order. Likewise, Jude, verses 6 and 7, talks about the angels who kept not their first estate or their proper position, but are now in chains in gloomy darkness until the judgment. And it's clear when you read 2 Peter 2 and Jude, it is clear that the sin that the angels committed, who are now in chains in gloomy darkness, was a sexual sin. Jude says, like Sodom and Gomorrah. They committed a sexual sin. The only place in Scripture where we read that happening is Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4, where the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were fair, and they took wives of any they chose. And from them came the giants. I don't have time to really dive into that in this presentation, but if you've read our book Veneration, you know where we're going with that. The veneration of the Nephilim, later called Rephaim, inspired the cults of the dead that have persisted into the modern world. Ancestor veneration comes from the worship of the Nephilim more than 6,000 years ago. Kumarbi. Who is Kumarbi? Kumarbi was the father god of a people called the Hurrians. They're in the Bible. They're called Horites. They came from a civilization that archaeologists have traced back to the plain of Ararat. They created a very unique style of pottery. God bless the archaeologists who go out in the field and dig up these little bits and pieces and then glue them back together and say, oh, okay, this is black and red burnished ware, 5th millennium BC. We read their papers, so you don't have to. Because, you're welcome. Because they don't view this through a biblical lens. The plains of Ararat is where this people group came from, and they spread out through the outer edge of the Fertile Crescent. They were down into Israel. They were down into Israel. In fact, King David, when he bought the threshing floor of Araunah, after he commissioned the census, and God said, okay, you're going to have to accept a punishment here. And the destroying angel stopped over the threshing floor of Araunah. Araunah is a Hurrian title that means Lord. The Hurrians have had far more, and I go into that a lot in the forthcoming book. But the point is that Kumarbi, like Kronos, if you know the Greek myth, overthrew his father, the sky god, and when he overthrew them, he castrated his father, just like Kronos did. The main difference in the story is that Kronos used a sickle, and Kumarbi used his teeth. Yeah, I know. Bleh. It's distasteful. But Kumarbi, like Kronos, like Saturn, like all of the iterations of this entity here, Enlil of the Mesopotamians, El of the Canaanites, Dagon of the Philistines, Milcom, and I'll talk about him in just a sec, Ashur of the Assyrians, Baal-Hamon of the Phoenicians, they all had connections to the netherworld. I go into this in great detail in the book. They all were connected to the netherworld. In all of their stories, it's the same pattern repeated over and over. They overthrew their father, the sky god, which I believe is a fake news version of the fallen realm rebelling against the one true God, Yahweh. Oh, he's powerless now. He's been castrated. In the ancient world, that was a big thing. You ever wonder why Absalom went into his father's concubines after his rebellion in the sight of all Israel? That was sort of a crude way of saying, I'm the man. Dad can't stop me. That's what this story's about. And yet, then we get another fake news version. That entity, Kumarbi, El, Enlil, Dagon, overthrown by the storm god called Teshub, Tarhunta, Baal, Zeus, Jupiter, and banished to the netherworld. That's a fake news version of what really happened, where God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them down to Tartarus. That's who this entity is. The Romans were the most recent group to adopt this god, and they called him Saturn. And isn't it curious that the most popular annual festival in Rome, the Saturnalia, was given in honor of the deity whose only really notable achievement was eating his own children so they wouldn't overthrow him and kick him off the throne. If you know the story of Kronos, Saturn, it's the same deal. There was a prophecy their children would overthrow them, and so when they were born, they ate them. And that brings us to Milcom, or Molech. Milcom, called the abomination of the Amorites, or the Ammonites, the kingdom of Ammon, eastern neighbors of Israel. Milcom is a word in the Ammonite language that means king. But the Hebrews, playing with languages they love to do, they changed a couple of the vowels, changed it to Molech. the god who demanded that his worshipers pass their children through the fire, sacrifice them and burn them. Baal Hamon, another version of that. Just within the last 10 years, scholars have finally decided, yeah, the Phoenicians of Carthage, they really did sacrifice their children. Yeah. The Greeks and the Romans of the 1st and 2nd century were writing about this and how appalled they were. But it's been going on for a very long time. And it continues to this day. You want to know the number one cause of death around the world last year? Abortion. Even chained in the netherworld, this god still influences the world today. And there is one other entity, by the way, one other identity by which this old god is known. But I'm going to withhold that for now for dramatic tension. So, now, what is the significance of the Capitol? Why do I connect this to the United States Capitol? Tom Horn had written about this in Apollyon Rising 2012 and Zenith 2016. He's talked about the occult significance and symbolism of the architecture of the United States Capitol. You've got the generative member, I'm being delicate here, the generative member of Osiris on the right and the womb of Isis in the dome on the left. This, Tom wrote, and I believe he's correct, symbolized what they believed would be the ultimate combination of that generative power to bring forth the Antichrist, or at least to bring forth an entity who would rule over a new golden age. That's how I argue it in the new book. But there's more to it than this. The United States Capitol. You ever wondered why the Capitol is called the Capitol? I always thought it was called the Capitol because that's what you call the Capitol. It's the Capitol. It's where, the government meets. Not so. In 1799, when they were designing Washington, D.C., and I'll set aside all of the weird Freemasonic symbolism and geometry and the layout of the streets. We'll just focus on the Capitol here. There was only one building on the planet where a legislative body met in a building that was called the Capitol. And that was in Williamsburg, Virginia, which is the colony that produced Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, among others. The architect, Pierre Charles L'Enfant, wanted to call the building where the United States Congress met Congress House. Simple, not imaginative, but it describes the function of the building. Congress House. Thomas Jefferson insisted that it be called the Capitol. And there were a number of letters that have been preserved in the National Archives, back and forth between the two. Jefferson insisted on calling it the Capitol because that's the name of the temple of Jupiter in Rome. The temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, is called the Capitolia. Now, why is it called the Capitolia? It's called the Capitolia because when the foundation for this temple was being dug back in the late 6th century BC by Tarquinius Superbus, his diggers found a well-preserved human head. Now, you and I, upon such a discovery, would probably first call the police after, throwing up lunch and begin an investigation. But apparently, to the ancient Etruscans, and remember, Tarquin was an Etruscan, not a Roman, this was considered a good omen. This means Rome is going to be totally awesome. And so they decided to call the hill on which the temple was being built the Capitoline Hill. And they decided to call the temple the Capitolia. And so our legislative headquarters here in the United States is named for the temple of Jupiter because they found a severed head 2,600 years ago when they dug the foundation, and because that was supposed to be a good omen. So our legislative headquarters named for the temple of Jupiter, but the thing is, the temple of Jupiter doesn't have a dome on the top. This is an artist's rendering of what they thought the temple of Jupiter looked like. Actually, this looks more like the Supreme Court building, which is, again, not coincidental. So what inspired the dome? That was inspired by the Pantheon in Rome. The Pantheon was dedicated to the gods of the Roman Pantheon, but it includes a very unique feature inside its dome, which is this, the oculus. Oculus is the word for eye. It is open to the sky, or it was back in the day. It's got plexiglass over it now, but back in the day, it was open to the sky because it represented the apotheosis of Caesar, the becoming of a god of Caesar. Caesar would ascend from the floor of the Pantheon through the oculus into the heavens to become one of the gods. And interestingly enough, inside the United States Capitol is an oculus. Now, it's not open to the sky, but in 1865, Congress commissioned this. Italian artist Constantino Bramiti. This is called the Apotheosis of Washington. George Washington becoming a god. Not only becoming a god, but presiding over the gods. You notice he is draped in purple there. Purple is the color of royalty. George Washington didn't want to become a king, so he was elected president, but in 1865, he's depicted as a king inside the dome of the United States Capitol. On his left, the goddess Victoria, the Roman equivalent of Nike. On his right, the goddess of liberty. She's wearing a red liberty cap, also called a Phrygian cap. Stick a mental bookmark in that. You'll notice that she, by the way, is holding a fasces in her left hand. Fasces, from which we get the word fascist, fascism. It's a symbol of power and authority. And then around the outside of the painting, around Washington and the 13 maidens symbolizing the 13 original colonies, some of which have their backs turned to Washington because, 1865 there was a war on and some of the colonies were not, part of the Union at that moment or had just come back into the Union, not against, and against their will. Clockwise around the outside of the Apotheosis of Washington are symbols, or scenes rather, called war, science, marine, commerce, mechanics, and agriculture, essentially defining the new golden age into which George Washington had brought the United States of America. Symbols of American power and ingenuity, wealth. But here's the other thing that I think is really interesting. In ancient Rome, the statue of Saturn in the Temple of Saturn, which I should point out, by the way, was at the base of the Capitoline Hill. So you had the Temple of Jupiter up here on top of the hill, the Temple of Saturn down here, kind of symbolizing the way things had shifted in Rome. Saturn used to be the top dog. In fact, the Capitoline Hill, before they found that severed head, was called Mons Saturnus, the Mount of Saturn. Anyway, in the Temple of Saturn below the Temple of Jupiter, the statue of Saturn always had his legs wrapped in wool, symbolizing the fact that he was bound in the netherworld, in Tartarus. George's legs, bound in this purple cloth. Now, around the painting, 72 five-pointed stars, which Tom Horn describes as a powerful Pythagorean Freemasonic binding utility. 72 stars representing the gods of the nations. In ancient Near Eastern symbolism, 72 or 70, the symbolism is the same, is a number that represents all of them, the complete set, not one left out. When God divided the nations after Babel, according to Deuteronomy 32:8, he numbered them according to the number of the sons of God. When you go back to the table of nations in Genesis 10, 70. In other words, those 70 represented every other nation to which God had allotted the host of heaven as their gods. He reserved only Israel for himself. This represents George Washington in a very Saturn-like depiction as the sovereign over the gods of all the nations. Now, here's another bit of symbolism that has escaped us to this point, and this is something that I need to credit Sharon for pointing this out. In the scene called agriculture, around the outside of the Apotheosis of Washington is a scene called agriculture. And here you see the goddess Ceres, the grain goddess, with young America depicted as a young man wearing a toga and a Phrygian cap. Now, the Phrygian cap, so called because it was associated with Western Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, the land called Phrygia. You might not have heard of the land, but you've heard of its most famous king, Midas. Yeah, he was a real guy. You know the guy with the golden touch? That part's probably made up. But Midas was a real guy. But Phrygia was very important. In fact, I was just reading some research last night that probably all of these stories from Mesopotamia, Kumarbi and El and Enlil and Dagon, got moved to Greece as the story of Kronos and then to Rome as the story of Saturn by way of Phrygia. The stories moved through what is now Turkey, through Greece and on to Rome. So young America, depicted as a young man with a toga and a Phrygian cap, the relevant part here is that the way he's depicted in this image is very similar to classical artwork about a minor figure in mythology called Ganymede. Now, I thought Ganymede was just the name of one of Saturn's moons, but it's based on this. This is a late Roman mosaic depicting a story in which the storm god Zeus sees Ganymede, who's described by Hesiod as the comeliest of men. The comeliest of men. In fact, he's so comely that Zeus swoops down as an eagle and carries him off to Olympus to become the cupbearer of the gods. Now, it sounds like a great deal. I mean, who wouldn't want to live among the gods? Pretty easy life, huh? You just pour the water for the gods or the ambrosia or whatever it is they drink, and that's a pretty easy gig. But there's more to the story than that. The Greek philosopher Plato, writing in the 4th century BC, wrote this and attributed the origin of this story of Ganymede's abduction by Zeus to the people of the island of Crete, quoting, "Whether one makes the observation in earnest or in jest, one certainly should not fail to observe that when male unites with female for procreation, the pleasure experienced is held to be due to nature. But contrary to nature, when male mates with male or female with female, and that those first guilty of such enormities were impelled by their slavery to pleasure. And we all accuse the Cretans, people of Crete, of concocting the story about Ganymede, because it was the belief that they derived their laws from Zeus. They added on this story about Zeus in order that they might be following his example in enjoying this pleasure as well." In other words, Plato's saying the people of Crete made up this story to justify engaging in same-sex relations. And the Romans understood that this was the meaning of this story too, because the Latin form of Ganymede's name is Catamitus, and in English the word catamite refers to a young male who is the submissive partner of an older male. Now, here's the kicker. And this ties us back to where we began as we talked about what happened on the winter solstice last year. Zeus honored Ganymede by granting him immortality and placing him among the stars as the constellation Aquarius. In short, this section of the Apotheosis of Washington represents America as the submissive partner of Zeus, the storm god, who Jesus in Matthew 12, verses 22 through 26, and in Revelation 2, equated with Satan. Think about that. The body that legislates laws for the United States of America meets in a building named for the temple of the storm god, the temple of Satan in Rome, and is depicted on the inside of that building, the United States, young America, as the submissive partner of Satan. Here's more. The main floor of the Capitol, called the crypt. There's nobody buried there. This is just the ground floor, but the plan was, after George Washington died, to move his body to a chamber off the side of the crypt where he would reside forever. In fact, the Capitol was designed with a 10-foot diameter hole directly above where Washington's casket was to lay, so that people in the rotunda, which is the level from which you can see the oculus, could look down and see George, and then look up and ultimately see the Apotheosis of Washington, symbolizing a return from the netherworld by this old god Saturn, in my view. Now, it never happened, because by the time they were getting ready to put Washington's body in the Capitol, there were construction delays, and then the British burned the Capitol. That was a problem. So things were delayed until the 1830s, and George's descendants said, no, we're not going to do that. He's going to stay at Mount Vernon. But this painting, I believe, depicts the desire of this entity, Shemiyaza, Enlil, El, Dagon, Kronos, Saturn, the return from the netherworld to assume what he believes is his rightful place in the heavens as the king of creation, overseeing all of creation and ruling over the gods of the nations. And I believe, and this is where we get back to modern politics, and thanks again to Sharon for pointing this out, this is symbolized by the events of January 6th. You see, this happened and triggered a sort of a collective insanity amongst our political class. Our ruling elites and the political commentators of the United States. Many of them called this riot, not insurrection, but this civil disturbance at the Capitol, a desecration of sacred space. Our political class considers this sacred space. Senator Chuck Schumer, this temple to democracy was desecrated. Senator Amy Klobuchar desecrated this temple of our democracy. Senator Dick Durbin, this temple to democracy was defiled by thugs. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, this dome of this temple of democracy. Representative Liz Cheney, the most sacred space in our republic. Excuse me, Representative Cheney, but the most sacred space in this republic is wherever you are when you're in your prayer closet. Not this building that houses the members of Congress. And who led this desecration of sacred space? This guy, the buffalo hat shaman. And he's got a stage name. His real name is Jacob Chansley, and God bless him. But his stage name is Jake Angeli, Angel-y. I mean, come on. Do you need to send up a flare to get our attention? But the significance here is that he's wearing the buffalo hat. The name of Kronos, the king of the Titans, who led that rebellion under the guise of Shemiyaza. The name derives from a Semitic word, karen, that means horns, the horned one. The main epithet or nickname of the Canaanite version of this god, El, was Bull El. And they did this on January 6th. I mean, this symbol of divinity, you can see it in the ancient world. Sumer, Cyprus, Sumer again, horns, sign of divinity. And they did this on January 6th, which is a date celebrated each year by Western Christians as Epiphany, Theophany by Christians in the Eastern Church, which is the date that the divinity of Christ was revealed to the world, when the wise men arrived at the manger and recognized him as the Son of God, God in the flesh. That's the date that they chose to desecrate the temple of democracy. No, it was a symbolism. Hey, the old God's coming back. I think that's what we're looking at here. So you've got the obelisk in the dome of the United States Capitol. It's not the only one in the world, of course. You've got the Vatican with the obelisk in the dome there in Rome, but it's not limited to Christians. How many mosques have you seen? Just about every mosque on planet Earth. In fact, most mosques have 4, 5, 6. Mecca has got what, like 10, 12? Unbelievable. And Islam represents the religion that, according to research by the Pew Research Group, at its current rate of growth, Islam will be the world's largest religion within 50 years. For two reasons. Number one, we in the West aren't having enough children. But secondly, the children that we have had, we have not trained up in the way they should go. They are falling away from the faith because they don't understand that the enemy, the fallen realm, number one, is real, and number two, takes this really seriously. Now, do I think that Thomas Jefferson or Constantino Brumidi or anyone else involved with construction design of the United States Capitol really understood that this was what they were putting into the art and architecture of the Capitol? No, I don't think so. But if we believe that our real enemies are the principalities and powers behind the scenes, and Jefferson, being a secularist, creating the Bible where he cut out all the words of Jesus, because I just can't believe that ever happened, which sadly is the position of a lot of pastors in the pulpit on Sunday mornings. I just don't get the whole resurrection thing. What, are you kidding me? The whole Bible is about resurrection. It's about who gets resurrected at the end. But our pastors aren't taught that, so they don't teach it. We don't learn it. We don't pass it on to our kids. And so we're bringing kids out onto a battlefield, and they're wondering why bad things are happening to good people. It's because you're in the middle of a war. You're in the middle of a war. And we should not be surprised that this is happening here in this United States. We like to think of ourselves as a Christian nation. I'm sorry, we're behind enemy lines. Look at Luke chapter 4, verse 5. The devil took Jesus up and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time and said to him, "To you I will give all this authority and their glory, for it has been delivered to me, and I give it to whom I will. If you then will worship me, it will all be yours." What did Jesus say? He did not say, you don't have the authority to make that kind of a deal. No. He said, Jesus answered him, "It is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." He called Satan the god of this world. We are behind enemy lines. God reserved one nation for himself, and I've got a clue for you. It isn't the United States of America. We are not Israel. Whatever you think of the current government in Israel, we are not Israel. We're operating like spies behind enemy lines. And we were given one job, one mission. Matthew 28, beginning at verse 18. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. Please note that there Jesus did not say, go forth and form political action committees, electing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Now, please understand me. I am not saying we should withdraw from the world and not be active politically. Yes, fight against the corruption. Fight the fix. But remember, that is not our ultimate mission. Our prime directive is to make disciples, which means not just witnessing and sharing the hope that we have in Jesus Christ, but training up our children in the way they should go. Teach them the nature of this battle that we're in. The spirit realm is real. 60% of American Christians don't believe that Satan exists. 60% of American Christians don't think the Holy Spirit is real. If you hold those views and you call yourself a Christian, I'm sorry, you don't know the meaning of that word. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. At the end of the day, even with free and fair elections, we will not put Jesus Christ in the White House. We will not pack the court with apostles. The gods of the ancient world, the fallen angels and demons who masquerade as gods, are still with us. So how then shall we live? 3,400 years ago, on a hill in ancient Canaan. Joshua, addressing the tribes of Israel, said this: "Fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." We had the opportunity. That altar, by the way, has been found by archaeologists. We had the opportunity to stand there and repeat that 2 years ago. It is a life-changing experience. But here's the good news of all this. This return of old Saturn will only last half a year. Old Saturn's reign, when he comes back, and I believe he will only last, to be precise, 5 months. Remember, I told you that the sons of God rebelled against their Creator in Genesis 6, thrust down to Tartarus, the abyss. And in Revelation 9, we see that there are entities that come back out of the abyss. Revelation 9, when the fifth angel blows his trumpet, they torment those without the seal of God on their foreheads. But they were allowed to torment them for 5 months. Guess what? This bookends the story of Noah, when they were thrust down to the abyss for their rebellion. Genesis 7, beginning at verse 23. "Only Noah was left and those who were with him in the ark, and the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. In a 30-day lunar calendar, that's exactly 5 months. They were in the abyss for 5 months while the waters on earth destroyed their children, the half-breed, miscegenated Nephilim, and at the end of days, they will get 5 months to torment those without the seal of God in their foreheads." And here's another connection, I believe. We read in 2 Kings 23 that Solomon built high places for Astarte, Chemosh, and Milcom. Milcom, the abomination of the Amorites. And because of this, the rabbis call the Mount of Olives the Mount of Corruption. The Mount of Corruption. Because Solomon put a temple on the Mount of Olives for this entity, Milcom, Molech, the king. If you've ever been to Jerusalem, you know that the Mount of Olives looks down on the Temple Mount, where God's house was located. But in Hebrew, the term translated Mount of Corruption is Har HaMashkith. Mashkith means destroyer. It's the Mount of the Destroyer. Let's flip back to Revelation 9. What does Abaddon mean in Hebrew? The destroyer. Apollyon in Greek? The destroyer. We're talking about this old entity, Saturn, Kronos, Baal-Hamon, Dagon, Asher, Enlil, El, Kumarbi, Shemiyaza, the leader of this rebellion before the flood, comes back. And he has been influencing the world through his minions, his children, his demonic offspring for thousands of years. But I will say, as I said at the beginning, we should not be surprised when we see the things that have happened in the political realm. We should not be distracted by the political fight. Yes, politics is important because it governs how we live. But what was our one job that we were given? To make disciples. If we could do that at the ballot box, that would be awesome, because we'd only have to worry about it every 2 years. That would be fantastic, but that's not how it works. Don't be discouraged, because yes, these things are disturbing, but what it should do is motivate us to be deployed. The church has not been sidelined, it has been deployed. We know the time is growing short. We know, all of us, family members, friends, colleagues, co-workers who have not yet accepted the saving grace of Jesus Christ. This destruction is coming. The destroyer is coming. Please join us. We've got a ticket out of here. Whether it's through the rapture or by being sealed in the forehead, I don't know. Let's not argue about that. Let's share the hope that we have and make disciples while we still have time. The Lord our God has promised to take care of this. Psalm 82. Read Psalm 82. It is a courtroom scene in heaven. When God divided the nations, He numbered them according to the number of the sons of God. This was a test, as Sharon puts it in her Red Wing Saga series, a test and a trap. God knew what was going to happen. These are the entities who the world has known for thousands of years as Baal and Aphrodite and Apollo, Thor, Hercules. God sat them down in the midst of the divine council and said, I said, you are gods, all of you, sons of the Most High. Nevertheless, like men you shall die and fall like any prince. Our Savior has got this. Do not be distracted. Do not be discouraged. Be deployed. And come quickly, Lord Jesus. Amen.